I wasn't supposed to be there that night. That's the part that still gets me when I think about it. I was supposed to be off rotation. I was supposed to be 3 decks below, asleep in my bunk with a novel I'd been trying to finish for 6 weeks, a cup of cold coffee on the side table, and the low hum of the station's recyclers lulling me into something resembling peace. Instead, I was elbow-deep in the tertiary mapping core at 14 hours because Specialist Yemi Ajora had flagged an anomaly in Sector Grid 9. Foxtrot and I was the only senior cartographer on call who knew that particular system well enough to diagnose it without waking the whole department. So there I was in the dark, alone with the machines. Helios 7 wasn't glamorous. None of the mapping stations were. People imagine what we did spent our days staring at beautiful star fields, watching nebulae bloom and die in slow motion across holographic displays, drinking something warm and feeling poetic about the universe. And that image was about 40% accurate on a good day. The other 60% was maintenance logs, calibration cycles, data compression protocols, and the particular kind of fatigue that comes from staring at a screen long enough that the numbers start looking like faces. But the maps themselves, those were something. I don't think most people understood what the Helios network actually held. Not really, not in a bone-deep way. We'd been building it for 63 years. Ever since first contact with the Vreth Confederation had opened the galaxy up, and humanity had done what humanity always does when it encounters a new frontier. We started mapping it obsessively. Every star, every system, every dust lane and gravitational shadow and navigational hazard between here and the outer concordance. We'd sent survey drones into regions that even the elder species hadn't bothered to chart, not because we needed to go there immediately, but because we wanted to know. Because not knowing something felt like a wound that needed treating. The Galactic Council called us compulsive. They said it with that particular species-level condescension that the elder races had perfected over millions of years of practice. We kept mapping anyway. So when the anomaly pinged on Grid 9, Foxtrot at 58 hours, I dragged myself out of bed and went to go fix it. Because that's what you did when you were responsible for one of the most comprehensive star map databases in the known galaxy. I noticed the temperature difference first. Not dramatic, just a half-degree drop that my skin registered before my brain did. The corridor leading to the tertiary core ran slightly warmer than the rest of the station because of the processing heat. Always had. The drop meant something was either drawing excess power from a different source or... And then I turned the corner and saw the open panel. My stomach did something complicated. The access panel to the primary data transfer manifold was open and hanging at an angle I'd never seen before, like someone had forced it in a hurry rather than unlocking it through the proper sequence. 3 of the 4 coupling bolts were sheared flush against the housing. I stood there for a moment. Just stood there. My brain was running 2 processes simultaneously. The slow, professional part that was cataloging details, temperature, panel angle, sheared bolts, which diagnostic lights were still active, and the faster, quieter part underneath that was already whispering something's very wrong here. I stepped closer. The transfer manifold inside was dark, which it should not have been during any legitimate maintenance window, because the manifold being dark meant no active connection, which meant data wasn't moving, which meant... My communicator buzzed. Yemi's voice came through, clipped and strange. "Rays, you need to get to command. Right now, don't stop. Don't call anyone else first, just come." I'd worked with Yemi for 4 years. She was the calmest person I'd ever met. During the Proxima incident, when a survey drone had somehow transmitted what we later determined to be the first recorded image of a black hole's event horizon at close range and half the department had briefly stopped functioning in a religious sense, Yemi had just leaned back in her chair, looked at it for a long moment and said, "Well, That'll need a new filing category. She had never, in 4 years, sounded like she sounded on that communicator. Yemi, I said, the transfer manifold is open and dark. I'm looking at it right now. A pause, then I know. What happened? Another pause, longer, and then she said the 8 words that I would spend the next 3 days hearing in my sleep. Someone took the maps, Nalin. Someone took all of them. Official Incident Report, Earth Unified Intelligence Command. Classification, Omega Red. Reporting Officer, Director Sable Akafer, Helios Network Security Division. File, Day 00600 hours. At approximately 0200 hours, Station Helios 7 experienced a coordinated, multi-vector intrusion event targeting the primary cartographic data core. The intrusion was executed with a level of technical sophistication that exceeded any threat model previously developed for this facility. Preliminary analysis suggests the breach required advanced knowledge of station rotation cycles and staffing patterns, the specific architecture of the Helios 7 data transfer manifold, Earth unified encryption protocols at the Tier 6 level, and the exact physical location of 3 different shielded conduits that do not appear in any published station schematic. The attackers accessed the tertiary mapping core, bypassed 4 layers of cryptographic security using what our forensic team initially described as an impossible key, a term I've asked them to revise in the formal report, because the key was clearly not impossible. Someone clearly had it, and extracted a complete copy of the Helios Master Cartographic Database. Everything, every star, every navigational lane, every hazard, every shortcut, every survey annotation added by 6 decades of human cartographers. 12 million data points covering approximately 34% of the known galaxy, including 17% that humanity had charted independently in regions the elder species had not yet surveyed. The extraction took 11 minutes. The manifold was dark for 11 minutes while we were all asleep or occupied with a fabricated anomaly in Grid 9 Foxtrot. An anomaly that forensic analysis confirms was artificially introduced to draw personnel attention away from the primary core. Whoever did this planned it carefully. Physical evidence recovered at the scene. 4 sheared manifold bolts, trace particulate matter later identified as consistent with Vreth-manufactured atmospheric processing compounds, and a single item that I will address separately because it defies easy categorization. On the floor of the tertiary core room, placed with what I can only describe as deliberate precision, was a small object approximately 8 centimeters long. It appeared to be a Vreth sigil rod, a ceremonial item used by high-ranking members of the Vreth Confederation's Navigator caste, the kind that are individually inscribed and registered, the kind that can be traced. It was not dropped accidentally. That's the part that sat wrong with me from the first moment I saw it in the evidence photographs. 11 minutes. Sophisticated enough to break our Tier 6 encryption, careful enough to introduce a fake anomaly to pull our attention, and then they left a sigil rod on the floor. I flagged this inconsistency in my report. I flagged it 3 times. My supervisor, Director General Waverly, looked at it, looked at me and said, "Let's not overcomplicate this, Sable. The evidence points where it points." I wrote a 4th flag and filed it anyway. Personal testimony, Specialist Yemi Adjora. Recorded by Intelligence Debrief Team, Day 1, 11, 30 hours. Transcript begins. The anomaly in 9 Foxtrot wasn't real. I know that now. At the time I thought it was just a weird drift in the calibration cycle. We get those occasionally when the thermal expansion in the outer hull affects the sensor array mounts. It happens, so I flagged it and called Nalin because he knows that system better than anyone. But looking at the timestamp later, The anomaly was introduced at exactly 01:47 hours, 13 minutes before the breach began. Someone knew I was on monitoring duty. Someone knew that an anomaly in 9 Foxtrot would pull a senior cartographer rather than a general maintenance tech. That's the part that made me feel sick. Not just that they knew our systems, that they knew our people, that they knew which of us would respond to which alert and how, and approximately how long it would take. When I realized the main core had gone dark, not crashed, gone dark, which is different because a crash throws errors and a deliberate disconnect doesn't, I sat there for maybe 40 seconds doing something I am not proud of, which is nothing. I just sat there. And then I thought about something my grandmother used to say. She was from Lagos. She used to say that the moment you realize something has been stolen from you is not the worst moment. The worst moment is the one right before, when it was already gone and you didn't know yet. Because in that moment before, you were helpless without the dignity of even knowing you needed to fight. She wasn't talking about star maps, but it applied. I called Nolan, then I called command. Then I sat down and started writing everything I remembered about the anomaly pattern, because I was a cartographer and that's what we do. We document, even when our hands are shaking. Transcript ends. Intelligence summary, Galactic Council emergency session. Transmitted to Earth Unified Command. Day 1, 14:00 hours. Summarized by Archivist General Myra Voss. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session at the request of the Vreth Confederation, within 6 hours of the breach becoming public knowledge. The Vreth Confederation's representative, Consul Paramount Zarek Volland, addressed the session in terms that I, even having reviewed the transcript 4 times, find difficult to describe charitably. He expressed condolences for the loss of the maps. He expressed hope that humanity would recover from this regrettable incident. He noted that the galaxy was a complex place, and that comprehensive navigational data in the wrong hands could have unpredictable consequences. And then he said something that has since become something of a rallying point, though not in the way he intended. He said, and I am quoting the verified transcript, "Perhaps it is for the best that such sensitive navigational infrastructure be managed by species with greater experience in galactic affairs. Humanity has shown great enthusiasm in its mapping endeavors, but enthusiasm without proper security protocols is a vulnerability that cannot be overlooked." He smiled when he said it. The Vreth smile differently than humans. Their facial musculature is arranged differently, but the sentiment translated perfectly across species lines. He was pleased with himself. The human representative at the session, Ambassador Lena Christodoulou, listened to all of this with the specific kind of stillness that I recognized from the debriefs later as someone deciding very carefully what not to say. She said 3 things. First, that humanity appreciated the Council's condolences. Second, that humanity was conducting its own investigation and would share findings at an appropriate time. Third, that humanity would be implementing new security measures for its navigational data effective immediately. Then she thanked everyone for their time and left. What she did not say, what nobody in that room knew yet, was that the investigation had already found something. Several things. Things that were going to make Consul Paramount Zarek Volland's pleased expression look very different in retrospect. Part 2. The investigation. Personal Field Log, Senior Cartographer Nolan Reyes. Day 1, 1845 hours. They brought in Commander Dace Harlow 12 hours after the breach. I knew who Harlow was by reputation, the way you know certain names in your field, not because you've met them, but because their work has a specific gravity that you feel even at a distance. He wasn't intelligence, not officially. He was a navigator, one of the best we had. 32 years in the Deep Survey Corps, the kind of career that involved going places the maps didn't cover yet, and coming back with the maps filled in. He'd been stationed out past the Concordance Rim for the last 2 years on something classified that nobody would tell me anything about. He showed up in the Helios 7 command center, wearing a survey corps jacket that looked like it had been through several interesting experiences, carrying a coffee he'd clearly made himself, because the station coffee machines had been locked down along with everything else, and looking like a man who had been told something unpleasant on the shuttle ride over and was still processing it. He looked at the forensic reconstruction of the breach on the main display for a long time. Nobody said anything. Harlow had a presence that generated silence, not an intimidating silence, more like a quiet that other people naturally filled in around him while he thought. Then he said, "Show me the sigil rod." They showed him the evidence photograph. He looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. "That's not right," he said. The security director, HFY, who I'd already developed a significant respect for, said, "I know." "A navigator-cast sigil rod," Harlow said. "From the VRETH registration marks high-ranking. You don't drop those. They're registered. They're traceable. The only way you leave one of those at a crime scene is if you're stupid or if you want it to be found. Or if you want people to think the VRETH did it," HFY said. Harlow put down his coffee. "Or if you want people to think the VRETH did it," he agreed. "Who else has access to VRETH navigator-cast items?" "The VRETH," someone in the room said. Harlow turned and looked at that person with an expression that was not unkind but was extremely patient. "I'd like a list," he said, "of every species with trade relations with the VRETH navigator cast in the last decade. I'd like the manifest of every shipment that included ceremonial or cultural items. And I'd like the complete access log for this station going back 18 months, not just visitors, contractors, supply runs, maintenance teams, drone operators, everyone." Then he looked at me. I hadn't been introduced. I was just a cartographer standing in the background trying to understand what was happening to my maps. "Your rays," he said. "Yeah. You found the open manifold." "I found it. You know the Helios database better than anyone." I thought about it honestly, me and Ajora pretty much. He nodded. "Then you're with me, because the theft is one problem, but what they do with those maps is a different problem, and I need someone who actually knows what's in them." That was how I ended up in the center of it. The maps that were stolen contain a specific category of data that I believe is the real target of this operation, rather than the general navigational data. I've been working the outer survey zones for 2 years. During that time, I've been mapping a region the elder species largely ignored, the space between the VRETH Concordance's eastern border and what they call the deep margin, an area they've historically flagged as navigationally hazardous and largely worthless. They were not entirely wrong that it's hazardous. There are significant navigational challenges in the deep margin: dense gravity fluctuations, irregular stellar bodies, several anomalous regions that affect standard FTL systems. They were entirely wrong that it's worthless. What we found in the deep margin, and what exists in the Helios database under survey annotations that would be unremarkable to anyone not specifically looking for them, is a network of what I'm going to call gravitational corridors, natural formations, passages through the unstable space that are actually, if you know exactly where they are and how to navigate them, faster and more reliable than the standard lanes. Not just faster, dramatically faster. The standard navigational lanes between major galactic territories are controlled by the VRETH Confederation, mostly in the Eastern Quadrant. They've held navigational sovereignty over those corridors for roughly 800 years. Every ship that passes through them pays a transit fee. Every supply chain that uses them operates on VRETH terms. The economy of the Eastern Quadrant runs on VRETH lane access. What we found in the deep margin bypasses all of it. Completely, entirely, without touching a single VRETH-controlled transit point. I didn't tell anyone about this immediately because the survey wasn't complete, and because I know what this information means in a geopolitical context, and I wanted to make sure we had it right before it became a negotiating tool or a flashpoint, or a reason for someone to do something stupid. But someone found out. Someone found out we had it, or suspected we had it, and they needed that data before we could use it. The theft of the star maps isn't about taking our maps away. It's about preventing us from knowing what we know. Too late. Personal field log, Senior Cartographer Nalin Reyes. Day 203 30 hours. Harlow told me about the corridors at 3 in the morning. We'd been in the analysis room for hours, just the two of us and Yemi and a security analyst named Tors, going through the database annotation records. Yemi had brought coffee that was actually good, which I hadn't expected, and Tors was very quiet and very good at his job, and Harlow explained the corridors the way someone explains something they've been sitting with for a long time and are finally relieved to say out loud. I'm a cartographer. I've spent most of my adult life thinking about space as a thing to be measured and documented. I have a professional relationship with awe. You encounter it often enough in this work that you learn how to process it and keep moving. But sitting there in that room at 3 in the morning, listening to Harlow describe what they'd found in the deep margin, I felt the particular quality of stunned silence that only comes from a discovery that reorganizes the architecture of what you thought was possible. How many corridors? Yemi asked very quietly. 14 confirmed, Harlow said. Possibly 23 if the survey data from the northeast approaches holds up. And they bypass the Vreth lanes. Every major one in the eastern quadrant. You could get from the Concordance border to the outer rim in a third of the standard transit time, without passing through a single Vreth checkpoint. Tors, who had not spoken in 45 minutes, said, "They didn't steal the maps to hurt us. They stole the maps because if we published those corridors, it would collapse their entire transit economy." Harlow looked at him. Yeah. And whoever stole the maps wanted to either destroy the data or use it themselves. Yeah. I thought about the sigil rod on the floor of the tertiary core. I thought about Consul Paramount Valen's smile at the Galactic Council session, the pleased with himself quality of it. I thought about the way he'd said, "Perhaps it is for the best." They didn't just want the data, I said. They wanted us discredited. They wanted it to look like we couldn't protect sensitive navigational information, so that even if we had more discoveries, nobody would trust us to manage them. Everyone in the room was quiet. 2 birds, Yemi said. Yeah, I said. 2 birds. Following Commander Harlow's analysis and cross-referencing the access logs with customs and supply chain records, we have identified the probable pathway of the intrusion. The Helios 7 station received a routine maintenance visit 4 months ago from a contracted systems company, Meridian Technical Solutions, for calibration work on the outer sensor array. The crew consisted of 6 technicians, all of whom passed standard security screening. Standard security screening does not include deep biometric analysis of species-derived physiological markers. One of the 6 technicians registered as human. The biometrics were consistent with human physiology. The documentation was impeccable. The documentation was also, we now believe, fabricated. The Grenthali, a species with significant shape-changing capacity, who operate extensively as contractors throughout the Eastern Quadrant, and who have maintained a complicated political relationship with the Vreth Confederation for several centuries, have the physiological capability to pass standard human biometric screening if they have access to baseline human physiological data, which is not classified. We are not stating definitively that the infiltrator was Grenthali. We are noting that the physical evidence, the capability profile, and the access timeline are consistent with a Grenthali operative working under a false identity. We are also noting that among the very small number of parties with access to Vreth Navigator-cast sigil rods through legitimate trade channels is the Grenthali Trade Assembly, which has maintained artifact exchange protocols with the Vreth Navigator cast for approximately 300 years. Someone stole our maps. Someone used a Vreth item to make it look like the Vreth. Someone with the capability to pass as human placed that item deliberately. The question of who commissioned the operation, who wanted those specific corridors badly enough to risk an interstellar intelligence incident, remains under active investigation. I have a theory. I am not yet stating it officially because I don't say things officially until I can back them up completely. But I have a theory, and it makes me very tired. Transcript begins. The thing you have to understand is that from the moment I heard about the breach, I wasn't thinking about the maps that were gone. I was thinking about the maps we still had. What was taken was a copy. A complete copy, yes. Everything in the Helios database. But the thing about information is that it can be copied again. The corridors existed whether the database did or not. The survey drones existed. The raw telemetry data existed. The notes in my personal log from 2 years of survey work in the deep margin existed. They took a copy of our knowledge. They didn't take our knowledge. And in the process, they told us something. If they went to this trouble, this level of sophistication, this level of planning, this much risk, then whatever was in those maps was worth all of that to someone, which meant we'd found something more important than we'd realized. I'd been cautious about the corridor discovery. Professional caution. We hadn't finished the survey. I wanted complete data before making any claims. Diplomatic caution. I knew what it meant for existing power structures, and I didn't want to light that fire without being ready for what came after. They lit the fire for us. Once the breach happened, once we understood what they were after and why, the only question was how we responded. Director General Waverly wanted to take it to the Galactic Council as an intelligence complaint. File the evidence, let the legal process work, recover the data through diplomatic channels. I said no. He said no wasn't an option. I said I understood that, and that I was saying no anyway, and that if he wanted to argue about it he should do it with Admiral Christodoulou, who I'd already briefed, and who agreed with me. Waverly called her. She told him the same thing. He didn't like it, but he stepped back. What we did instead. Well, you know what we did instead. You're here doing this debrief because of what we did instead. Transcript ends. I've been a cartographer for 11 years. I've charted things that nobody has ever seen before. I've put names to places that only existed as theoretical coordinates before I arrived. There is a particular satisfaction in that, quiet, professional lasting, that I have always considered the best thing about this work. I had never, in 11 years, thought of cartography as a weapon. Harlow had. He explained it to us in the briefing room on day 2, with Tors on one side and Yemi on the other, and Director Akafer sitting very still in the corner like someone watching a complicated game, whose rules she was just beginning to fully understand. The Helios database had been copied. Fine. It was gone, and it would take time to understand exactly how it was being used and by whom. That was a problem, but not the only problem. The corridor data was the key. 14 confirmed gravitational corridors through the deep margin, bypassing every major Vreth transit lane in the eastern quadrant. That data had been in the Helios database, yes. It had also, Harlow informed us, been stored redundantly in the Deep Survey Archive maintained at Earth Unified Command's primary intelligence facility, a facility that was not on any official station map and which operated on a completely isolated network. The thieves had taken the Helios copy. They had not taken the archive copy. Because they didn't know the archive existed. What they have, Harlow said, looking at the corridor map projected on the briefing room display, is our star charts, which is genuinely impressive intelligence. The navigational lanes, the hazard zones, the survey data for 60 years of exploration. That's a significant haul. He let that sit for a moment. What they don't have is this. He highlighted the deep margin on the display. They have the raw survey telemetry from the early passes, the data that went into the Helios database, but the corridor analysis, the synthesis work that turned that raw data into navigable routes, that's in the archive. That's mine. That's us. So they stole the paint, Torres said, but not the painting. Harlow looked at him. Something like appreciation moved across his face. Yeah, exactly. So what do we do? Yemi asked. We publish, Harlow said, all of it, everything. The corridor maps, the navigational specifications, the hazard profiles, the complete analysis. We make it available to every independent shipping company, every non-aligned species, every individual vessel operator in the Eastern Quadrant, free of charge, open access, no transit fees, no VRETH checkpoints. The room was very quiet. We do it before they can process what they've taken, he continued. Before they can figure out what they have and use it to their own advantage. We make it public knowledge. We make those corridors everyone's corridors. The VRETH, Akafor said carefully, will not respond well to this. No, Harlow agreed. They won't. The Galactic Council will accuse us of destabilizing established navigational sovereignty. Probably. This will be the most significant economic disruption to the Eastern Quadrant trade structure in 800 years. Harlow looked at Akafor directly. Yes, he said, it will. Another quiet moment. Then Akafor said, how long will it take to prepare the publication package? Harlow looked at me. I thought about the corridors. I thought about the database. I thought about 63 years of obsessive, compulsive, enthusiastic human mapping that had put us in this room with this information and this choice. Give me 18 hours, I said. I worked through the night. Yemi worked with me for the first 12 hours. Then Harlow came in around 03:00 and helped with the technical documentation on the corridor specifications. Then Torres brought food at some point that I didn't eat until it was cold. The station had this particular quality at that hour. Most of the crew was asleep, and the lighting was set to night cycle, and the only sounds were the recyclers and the data processing units and the quiet of space outside. I have charted a lot of space. I have put together a lot of documentation packages. I have written technical reports and survey summaries and navigational guides and cartographic monographs. I have never put together anything like what we built that night. The corridor maps were extraordinary. I want to say that clearly because I think in the rush of what came after, people focused on the implications and not the thing itself. The corridors themselves, the gravitational passages through the deep margin, were extraordinary. They were natural wonders in the same sense that the Grand Canyon is a natural wonder, except that they were formed by the slow gravitational dance of stellar masses over millions of years, and they were invisible to the naked eye, and they were the most significant navigational discovery in living galactic memory. We named them as we documented them. Harlow had been calling them by coordinates in his survey logs, professional habit, numerical identifiers, precise and anonymous. I was a cartographer who had spent 11 years thinking that the right name was one of the most important things you could give to a place. We named them together. The first one the widest, the most stable, the one that ran from the Concordance border to the Midrim Junction in approximately 1/3 standard transit time, we called the Ajora Passage. Yemi had fallen asleep in the analysis room by then. She found out later and pretended to be annoyed. She was not annoyed. The second one, which had a complicated doubleback in its midpoint that required precise navigation, but cut through a particularly contested region of the Eastern Quadrant, we called the Torres Run. The remaining 12 we named in a mix of Earth geography and human history, and a few names from Harlow's personal log that I thought deserved to be permanent. 14 passages, 14 names, 14 routes through space that nobody had owned and nobody could own, because they were natural formations in the universe, and we were just the ones who found them and wrote them down. That's what cartographers do. We write things down, and once something is written down and made public, it belongs to everyone. At 08:47 hours on day 3, we uploaded the complete corridor documentation package to the Open Navigational Registry, the interstellar equivalent of publishing in every journal simultaneously, posting to every navigational database, broadcasting on every frequency that trading ships and independent operators monitored. We sent a copy to the Galactic Council. We sent a copy to every species embassy in Earth Unified Territory. We sent a copy to every non-aligned shipping cooperative we could identify in the Eastern Quadrant. And then we sat back and watched what happened. Real-time observation log, compiled post-event. 11:17 hours. First independent confirmation that the publication has been received by the Outer Concordance Shipping Cooperative. Their navigational systems are already beginning to plot comparative routes using the corridor data. 11:43 hours. Vreth Confederation Diplomatic Office issues a statement describing the corridor maps as fraudulent and dangerous navigational data produced under contested circumstances. Does not specify what the contested circumstances are. Does not explain how they know about the publication this quickly. 12:09 hours. Independent verification of corridor data begins. The Macquarie Astronomical Survey, a highly respected non-aligned scientific body, announces they are deploying verification drones to the deep margin. Estimated analysis time, 6 weeks. This is the fastest I have ever seen them respond to anything. 12:55 hours. First independent shipping operator in the Eastern Quadrant announces it is rerouting its supply chain to use the Adjora Passage for a scheduled transit. This is happening. This is actually happening. 13:41 hours. Vreth Confederation escalates to a formal Galactic Council complaint. They are describing the corridor publication as an act of navigational piracy, a legal concept I have to look up, which turns out to be a Vreth-created legal framework for claiming sovereignty over navigational routes. The concept appears to require that the routes in question be artificial constructions, not natural formations. The corridors are natural formations. The Vreth legal team appears aware of this problem. The complaint gets filed anyway. 14:23 hours. Consul Paramount Volland holds a press address. He is not smiling. He says the discovery is unverified and potentially destabilizing. He says humanity acted irresponsibly. He uses the word enthusiasm again, but the context is different this time, and the tone is different, and watching it feels like watching someone try to put a dam in a river with their hands. 15:08 hours. Third shipping cooperative announces corridor rerouting. Then a fourth. The concordance rates are going up. They're raising transit fees to compensate for operators who aren't paying any transit fees at all because they're using the corridors. This is economically self-defeating. I don't think they have a better option right now. 17:30 hours. Macquarie preliminary survey confirms the existence of 11 of 14 corridors based on their own passive gravitational mapping data, which they apparently had in their own database, but hadn't analyzed for navigational applications. They release a statement calling the human corridor analysis a significant contribution to galactic navigational science. The Vreth legal argument that the data is fraudulent has now become significantly harder to maintain. 19:15 hours. Ambassador Christodoulou holds a press address. She is very calm. She says humanity is pleased to share its scientific findings with the galactic community. She says the corridors are natural formations and therefore cannot be owned. She says humanity looks forward to working with all partners on safe and equitable use of the new navigational routes. She does not mention the theft. She does not mention the investigation. She does not say anything that could be described as an accusation or a provocation or a declaration. She just talks about the science, about the maps, about what humanity found and why they're sharing it. She is better at this than anyone I have ever seen. 47 hours. Independent analysis of the sigil rod recovered from the Helios 7 breach is released publicly by Director HFY's team. This is intelligence data that should probably have stayed classified, but HFY has clearly made a call about what releasing it accomplishes. The analysis identifies the specific registration markings of the rod, traces it through the Vrethgranthali artifact exchange records, and identifies the rod as having been part of a shipment to the Granthali Trade Assembly 16 months ago. There is no accusation in the document. There's just evidence, documented clearly like a good investigative report should be. Here is the item. Here is where it came from. Here is how it got from there to the floor of our tertiary mapping core. Draw your own conclusions. 33 hours. Granthali Trade Assembly issues a statement saying they have no comment at this time. Vreth Confederation Diplomatic Office issues a statement saying they will cooperate fully with any legitimate investigation. The words legitimate investigation are doing a lot of work in that sentence. 22:00 hours. I stop logging and go find something to eat because it's been 11 hours and I'm running on coffee and something that I think might be the particular high of watching history happen in real time. The following is an excerpted and summarized account of the emergency session called by the Vreth Confederation. Full transcript available in classified appendix. Consul Paramount Volland opened the session with a prepared statement lasting approximately 20 minutes. The core argument was that humanity had published unverified navigational data in a manner that destabilized established transit frameworks, that the Helios breach investigation was being used as political cover for what was essentially an act of economic aggression, and that the Galactic Council should consider imposing navigational data restrictions on species that could not demonstrate appropriate stewardship of galactic infrastructure. He used the word enthusiasm 3 times. By the third instance, several delegates appeared to be having trouble with their expressions. Ambassador Christodoulou was given the floor. She spoke for approximately 8 minutes. She noted that the corridor data had been independently verified by the Macquarie survey. She noted that natural gravitational formations could not be subject to navigational sovereignty claims under any existing galactic legal framework. She noted that humanity had acted within its rights as a scientific and cartographic entity in publishing its findings. She said that Earth Unified Command would cooperate fully with any legitimate investigation into the Helios breach and had already shared the preliminary forensic findings with Council members. Then she said one more thing. She said that humanity had been charting the galaxy for 63 years, not for profit, not for strategic advantage, though advantage had come from it, because the universe was there and not knowing it felt wrong. And she said that when something was discovered, whether it was a new star or a new passage or a new truth, the human instinct was to write it down and share it, because knowledge hoarded was knowledge wasted. And she hoped the Council would understand that the publication of the corridor maps was not an act of aggression, but an act of exactly that impulse. Then she sat down. The session continued for another 4 hours. Ultimately, no action was taken against Earth Unified Command. The corridor maps remained public. 3 Council members, non-aligned species, who used Eastern Quadrant transit lanes regularly, and had been paying Vreth transit fees for generations, issued separate statements expressing support for the corridor publication and announcing their own navigational commissions to survey the deep margin further. One of those statements described the corridors as a gift to the galaxy from a species that has not yet learned to be selfish about knowledge, and which all of us should hope retains that particular quality. I had that statement printed and put on the wall of the analysis room. It's still there. I slept for 12 hours. This is not as long as I needed, but it was as long as I had before Harlow knocked on my door and told me the council session outcome and handed me a coffee that he'd made himself, which was apparently something he did as a way of indicating that he considered you worth the effort. I sat on my bunk and held the coffee and thought about what had happened. Someone had stolen our maps. 3 days later, the borders built on controlling navigational access through the eastern quadrant had, if not exactly collapsed, changed in a way that was permanent and irreversible. Every shipping cooperative that rerouted through the corridors was a permanent change. Every independent operator who no longer paid Vreth transit fees was a permanent change. Every species that was now talking about sending their own survey drones to the deep margin was a permanent change. You can't unknow something. That's the thing about maps. Once a place is charted and the chart is public, it belongs to everyone forever. They had taken our maps to prevent that, to keep the corridors secret, to suppress the knowledge, to maintain a monopoly on navigational access that had defined the power structure of the Eastern Quadrant for 8 centuries. They had accomplished the exact opposite. "How are you doing?" Harlow asked. He was sitting in the chair by the door, which was not a comfortable chair, but he was the kind of person who didn't seem to register discomfort unless it was extreme. "Tired," I said. "Weird." "Weird how?" I thought about it. "I'm a cartographer," I said. "I put things in their place on a map. I make the unknown known. I've always thought of that as a quiet job, important but quiet." I paused. This wasn't quiet. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "No." "Did you know this was going to happen? When you were surveying the corridors, did you know what it would mean?" Harlow was quiet for a moment. "I knew what it would mean if we found what I thought we'd find. I didn't know when it would become relevant. I thought we'd have more time to prepare." "They decided the timing for us." "Yeah," he said. "They did, which is probably the mistake they'll spend the longest time regretting." I drank my coffee. It was good. Outside the small window by my bunk, the stars were exactly where they had always been, doing exactly what they had always done, massive and ancient and indifferent to the small political dramas of the species who had recently gotten mobile enough to argue about them. "There's going to be more," I said. "There always is. More they didn't find, in the database, things we've been mapping that they didn't know to look for." Harlow looked at me. "Yeah. The deep margin survey. You said it was maybe 23 corridors." 23 if the northeast approach data holds up. I think it will. "And that's just one region." "That's just one region," he agreed. We had 63 years of data, 12 million data points. We had surveyed drones in the outer edges of the outer concordance rim, and along the scatter lanes, and in the uncharted spaces between the elder species' ancient territories where nobody had thought to look because nobody had bothered to look, and we had bothered because we always bothered, because that's who we were. Someone had taken a copy of our maps. We still had all the maps. And we were still mapping. The investigation into the Helios 7 breach has reached the following conclusions, filed for the public record. The intrusion was conducted by a single operative with Grenthali physiological characteristics using a fabricated human identity, with advanced technical intelligence on Helios 7 systems, and staffing protocols obtained through the maintenance visit conducted 4 months prior. The operative acted on behalf of a third-party commission whose identity remains under active investigation. The Vreth sigil rod found at the scene was not accidentally dropped. It was placed deliberately. in a manner consistent with an attempt to attribute the breach to Vreth agents. This conclusion is supported by the rod's registration provenance, which traces to the Grenthali Trade Assembly rather than any Vreth source. The motivation for the breach is now clear in retrospect. The commissioning party was aware, through some form of intelligence, that the Helios database contained survey data from the deep margin that could be used to identify navigable corridors bypassing established transit lanes. The goal of the operation was to acquire this data before it could be published or to destroy it entirely. The operation failed in its primary objective because the synthesis work, the corridor analysis itself, was not in the Helios database. It was in a separate archive that the operative did not know existed. I want to note something for the record that is not strictly within the scope of this investigation, but which I believe is relevant to understanding what happened. The breach was sophisticated, the planning was meticulous, the operative was skilled. By most measures, this was an extremely well-executed intelligence operation. It failed because it was built on an incorrect assumption. The assumption was that human cartographic data was centralized, comprehensible, and fully captured by the publicly known systems. The assumption was that the Helios database was where humanity kept its important discoveries. 63 years of compulsive, enthusiastic, obsessive mapping had produced a system so extensive and so redundantly documented that no single breach could capture it all. The archive that held the corridor analysis existed because Commander Harlow kept meticulous personal survey logs as a professional habit, and those logs were backed up to a separate system as a routine precaution. And that system happened to be off-network during the window of the breach, because it was undergoing a scheduled maintenance cycle. Not a design security measure, a habit, a professional habit. In 800 years of controlling navigational access in the Eastern Quadrant, the relevant parties had not accounted for the human professional habit of keeping meticulous backup documentation, because it feels wrong to let data live in only one place. They should have. Transcript begins. I've been asked to talk about what we found and why we shared it. People ask me if I was scared when I realized the maps were gone. Yes, I was scared. I sat at my station for 40 seconds doing nothing, which for me is a long time, and I was scared. But my grandmother used to say something about the moment before you know you've lost something, the helplessness of not knowing. I decided in those 40 seconds that I didn't want to stay in the helplessness. I wanted to know, and then I wanted to do something with the knowing. We did. We found out what they were after and why, and then we decided what to do about it. The corridors are named now. Some of them are named after us, after the people in that room on the night we figured it out. I find that strange and nice and a little embarrassing, in the way that I think all naming feels when the name is yours. But what I keep coming back to is this. Those corridors existed before we found them. They've been there for millions of years, carved by the slow drift of stellar gravity, waiting. And all the treaties and all the transit fees and all the navigational sovereignty claims and all the political arrangements built on controlling who could go where, none of that changed the fact that the corridors were there. We found them, we wrote them down, we shared them. That's all, that's the whole story. Someone tried to stop us from doing that, and instead of stopping us, they just made us do it faster. Transcript ends. The corridor verification is complete. 21 confirmed. The northeast approach held up 21 corridors through the deep margin, navigable, stable, documented, public. They're being used. Every day, ships are moving through space that was described as worthless and hazardous and not worth the trouble, and they're arriving at their destinations in a third of the time they used to take, without paying for the privilege, and the universe didn't end. The Eastern Quadrant didn't collapse. Trade is continuing. People are getting places. The Galactic Council has formed 3 new committees, one on navigational equity, One on corridor safety standards. One on what the Vreth Confederation's treaty status means in light of the economic changes. I've been asked to consult on the first two and declined the third because I'm a cartographer, not a diplomat, and I know my limits. The investigation into who commissioned the breach is ongoing. I have thoughts. I think most people have thoughts. Nothing has been officially concluded, and I'll follow the evidence where it leads and trust Akafor to do the same, because she is very good at her job. Harlow is back in the deep margin. New survey. He asked me to come. I said yes. We're looking for more corridors. We think there might be 17 additional ones in the northern approach. We think, based on the gravitational mapping data from the last survey cycle, that there's something significant in a region we've been calling the scatter fringe, an area the elder species have never mapped at all because they deemed it too unstable for navigation. They may have been right. It may be too unstable for navigation by most navigational standards. We're going to look anyway, because it's there and not knowing it feels wrong. That's the thing about us. That's the whole thing, really. We find things, we write them down, we share them. The galaxy keeps trying to figure out how to stop that from being a problem for people who built empires on other people, not knowing where things were. Good luck with that. We're going to need a bigger map. When I started the Deep Margin survey 2 years ago, I filed a routine pre-survey report that nobody read carefully. It said, in the technical language of the Survey Corps, that we were going to look at a region considered navigationally worthless by the existing galactic consensus and see if the consensus held up. It didn't hold up. It almost never does when we look carefully enough. I've spent 32 years looking at places the galaxy had decided weren't worth looking at. I've found 47 survey annotations in the Helios database that were later categorized as significant discoveries. 47 places that were blank on the map and aren't anymore. Someone stole the map. We still had the places. We always have the places. This document has been compiled from field logs, official reports, testimony transcripts, and personal accounts provided by the primary participants in the events of days 0 through 31 following the Helios 7 breach. The participants have reviewed the compilation and approved it for classified archival record. Commander Harlow asked that I note for the record that the events described here were not strategic genius or masterful planning. They were a combination of professional habit, good fortune, and what he described as the particular stubbornness of people who believe that knowing things is important. I asked Senior Cartographer Reyes for a closing statement. He gave me this. Maps don't belong to anyone. The territory doesn't belong to anyone. You can try to own the knowledge of where things are, but the things are still there whether you own the knowledge or not. All you can ever really do is look and write it down. We looked. We wrote it down. That's what cartographers do. I think that's enough. Archive closed.